second round, but all right. So without further ado, we are going to let me minimize all the things for just a second, and then I can introduce. So let's start over. Welcome to the Wolfpack Wellness Research Web Series. And I am your host, Dr. Suzie Goodell, an associate professor of nutrition in the Department of Food, Bioprocessing and Nutrition Sciences in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. That's a lot. The Wolfpack Wellness Research Web Series is a collaborative between the University Wellness Advisory Committee, the NC State Libraries, and NC State Wellness and Recreation, which you see here on our shirt. This series aims to discuss wellness research happening across NC State's campus, including Dr. Mary Haskett. But before we get into her work, I want to remind you there are many different types of wellness, including physical wellness, emotional wellness, social, purpose, community, and financial wellness. And we'll be in this series, we explore all different types of wellness. So just know that we're going to have a lot of variety in this show in general from month to month. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, thank you very much for being here. And if you have questions at any time, you can submit them in the chat function down below. Click on the little bubble box that gives you the chat feature. And we'll compile those questions as we go along. Oh, and we are on YouTube Live. Thank you, Tremaine. He just told us that. So we'll be monitoring some questions there if you have questions as well. So that is awesome. So as I said, today's guest is Dr. Mary Haskett. Mary is a professor in the Department of Psychology at NC State and the director of Family Studies Research Team. She and her students conduct research designed to identify resilient functioning of children who have faced adverse childhood experience, ACEs, and to test the effects of parenting interventions to reduce risk of maltreatment. And locally, Dr. Haskett co-founded REACH program, so it's Resilience, Empowerment, Access for Children Experiencing Homelessness. And she is leading NC Yay Babies, an initiative that helps increase early intervention and early education services for young children who experience homelessness. And the reason why Mary is here today is that on campus, she is the co-chair of the NC State Student Food and Housing Security Initiative. She collected data on food and housing security among NC State students before and during the pandemic. And that research and the commitment of many students, staff, and faculty across campus has contributed to new campus efforts to address food insecurity and homelessness at NC State. All the things. So welcome, Dr. Mary Haskett. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. So why don't you start with telling me a little bit about you and your research lab and this work that you have with hunger and homelessness?
Sure. Yeah. So as Suzie said, I teach in the psychology department. And probably about 5 years ago now, I've had students who have been working with me in local shelters here in Wake County. And the students' role has been to interact with the children in the shelters by either providing, childcare while their parents are involved in parenting groups, or maybe helping out with tutoring, or maybe serving as mentors. So the students are working in the shelters regularly, and several times I've had students in that research team who were themselves housing insecure. And I started asking more and more questions around campus about services that were available, thinking surely we must have some resources to ensure that our students are stably and safely housed. And sort of kept running up against dead ends. And so connected with a colleague who works with students in the TRIO program. It's Sarah Wright. And so Sarah and I decided to begin reaching out to other folks and students across campus who were interested in exploring these issues. And we formed this steering committee. And the first thing we thought would be important to do. Being the good academics that we are, is to measure the extent of the concern here at NC State. So that led to the initial research study.
Thank you. You mentioned an organization called TRIO. I'm not sure that everyone on this call is familiar with that. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it impacts students?
Sure. I'm not an expert on TRIO, but I'll tell you what I know. TRIO is a federally funded program. So while it's housed here at NC State, it's funded through federal funds. And the funds are established in order to help students who are under-resourced to make it through college successfully. And this is for students who might be first generation. They might be students who are exiting the foster care system. And they're provided with some additional financial resources, but even more importantly, they have a mentor that really meets with them regularly to help them orient themselves to a college environment. This is a complicated environment that we're in, and helps them sort of navigate their way through.
Thank you. So to follow up with that, why would TRIO be a good partner for this type of work related to housing insecurity and food insecurity?
Yeah, so Sarah Wright works directly with students who are in the TRIO program, and part of her role is to connect students to resources, both on campus and off campus. So she really is an expert in the resources and services that are most helpful for students. So it made sense and has been, just a fabulous partnership to join together with Sarah.
And are the students that are part of the TRIO program more likely or at greater risk for developing food insecurity and housing insecurity?
In general, yes, but the good news is that because they're in the TRIO program, they have access to people like Sarah. So while typically, yes, they would be at greater risk because of TRIO, some of the gaps in their services and resources are filled.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you said that you started your work in this area by doing a little research because that's what good academicians do. So can you discuss a little bit, without getting into all the jargon, can you discuss your approach to measuring the frequency, the prevalence of these things in our college?
Sure, yeah. And I think this is a pretty standard way to approach this kind of research. We used what's called mixed methods. One of our approaches is to take a look at big picture, sort of the bird's eye view of the full population of students. And we do that by conducting a survey. So we select a sample of students who are representative of our full population of students here at NC State. And we send a survey to that sample. And we cross our fingers and we provide a little bit of incentive and hope for a good response rate. And we have had good response rate. And that's important because it allows us to generalize our findings from our small sample to the large population. And I can talk about some of those findings. The other method that we use to solve big challenges, we really need to go to the individual level and understand individuals' challenges. So the way we do that is we conduct interviews with students who have experienced food or housing insecurity. And so we had a group of students here at NC State who interviewed other students who had had those experiences. And they were in-depth interviews. So we spent about an hour really digging deep into the experiences of students who had faced food insecurity or homelessness. And then we continue to do interviews until we reach what's called saturation. So we get to a point where no additional interviews would give us new information. And can I turn it back to you because you were involved in the analysis of those interviews?
Sure. And Dr. Natalie Cook is also on this call, but yeah, I'll kind of fill in the gaps from there. And basically what we do is we read those transcripts of the interviews afterwards, and we look for common experiences that people are talking about. And I apologize, my cat has decided to join us today as well. But yeah, we had students and and Dr. Cook and I read over these interviews to see what students were telling us, and that's kind of how we get the information, is just reading, pulling out. We like to call hashtags. The term is coding in the academic world, but it's like putting hashtags on certain quotes within the interviews to kind of try to find trends and themes related to what people were experiencing. And I think one of the things that you said that was really interesting is that we wanted to get on the individual level. And for me, a survey tells you how many people are doing things, but these interviews really can sometimes tell us why and how they're experiencing it, and looking at some of those factors that maybe even the students themselves didn't see as things that led to them ending up in places of food insecurity or housing insecurity. And I think the other interesting part of that is that we haven't yet defined for the group what is food insecurity and what is housing insecurity. So I think that was something in and of itself that students and maybe our audience kind of might be thinking, well, what is it? So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how broadly that can be defined. Take one of them first. Let's do food insecurity first, and how do you define it, and what are the factors that play a role in that food insecurity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a variety of definitions. In this world of food insecurity in higher ed, most people use the USDA definition. And that involves a shortage or a lack or insufficient food, and not having the resources to fill that gap. So it's sort of that two-pronged definition. It involves things like skipping meals or eating smaller meals than is necessary, or not having sufficient food for good health. Homelessness is defined two ways at the national level. One definition is pretty narrow, and it's the Housing and Urban Development, or HUD definition. And it involves literal homelessness, which is having no home at all, or being in a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. But there's also a Department of Education definition. And because we're in higher ed, we use the Department of Education definition in our work. And that includes literal homelessness, like staying outside in unsheltered areas, but it also includes staying in campers or cars because of not having an alternative. It also includes staying in motels because of, again, not having an alternative permanent place to live. And it also includes being doubled up with someone else, again, because you have nowhere else to go. Sometimes called couch surfing, which sounds kind of fun, right? It's not fun. It is highly stressful for individuals to be doubled up with others, and it can be dangerous, particularly for female students, because it's a desperate situation to stay wherever you're allowed. These kinds of situations are usually fraught with a lot of stress, because you don't know at any given time when you're going to be asked to pack your stuff up and get the heck out. This couch surfing is no fun. So that's the definition we used. It's a broader definition of homelessness.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I one of the things that stood out to me in the interviews was that some students experienced couch surfing, as sometimes it's called, and experienced that doubling up effect. And they didn't really define themselves as being homeless. But then as we talked with them more, they recognized the stress associated with that doubling up effect, as you were talking about. That is definitely something that we saw a lot in the interviews. So I just shared a little bit about the data, but first let's focus on the quantitative piece of things. So that's survey. Sorry, I'm using jargon again. But the survey work you did, can you tell us what the most important outcomes of the study were that you found in doing that survey work?
Sure. Yeah. So the survey that we most recently conducted was done in October of 2020. So about 7 months into the pandemic. And we were really interested in students' experiences during the pandemic. What we found was that 15% of our students had experienced homelessness since the pandemic began, and almost 25% had experienced food insecurity. So very high rates. These rates are consistent with a few other studies that have come out where exactly 15% homelessness was recently reported. So NC State is not unique. We don't have higher or lower rates than other institutions, but a lot of students are struggling. Those rates are very high. If you think about, we have 36,000 approximately students at NC State. So we're talking about a significant number of individuals who are struggling.
And what have we learned about what are some of the factors that are leading to this food insecurity and homelessness?
Yeah, I think probably some of our understanding of factors leading to it takes us back to the interview data, right? So I'm wondering if you could contribute to enlightening us on that.
Actually, if she doesn't mind, I'm going to pull in Dr. Natalie Cook, who is
Fantastic
here, and I'm going to let her share just a little bit about what we've found so far, knowing that the data are not finished being analyzed. This is the beginning.
Right. So I think that, when we look at qualitative data, I think what Dr. Haskett and Dr. Goodell have been talking about is this idea of a lived experience. And when we talk about a lived experience, that's another jargon way of saying, what circumstances have led to these situations. And so when we think about the factors that can relate to food insecurity and housing insecurity or homelessness, they're often linked. So they can be factors related to financial situations, related to, needing to have a job and, the job hours being cut short or needing to work on those, work additional hours to make that happen. There can be, family circumstances needing to, give money to support family members during that time. So those can be interplayed together. We actually saw something pretty interesting, which was this idea of getting out of housing situations often led to having to pay additional money to get into a new housing situation. And so that made food insecurity even more difficult because that often tends to be something that you can kind of cut back on because you have to pay your rent, you have to pay, these bills, but the food and coping mechanisms, things that Dr. Haskett talked about, of skipping meals or looking for more affordable options, looking for options that free food on campus and events that give those opportunities, or jobs that provide food along with that financial piece. And so, we saw a lot of those different factors kind of playing together. And then interestingly, something that we didn't necessarily, anticipate coming into it was this idea of transportation playing into that as well. And so transportation, thinking about having to have a vehicle or access to a vehicle or some type of transportation to get to a job, we have to be able to have that to be able to get the money to be able to pay for, the housing, but also food, but transportation also costs money as well. And so that can be a burden as well, a financial burden as well, especially if that transportation is not reliable as well. So that's just a small piece. We could go on and on about these different factors, but essentially what we discovered was it's very complex with the factors all linking together with food and housing insecurity, but then also that transportation piece playing into it as well. And ultimately, I'm sure you'll speak to this as well, but in that we found that students developed a good amount of resilience as well, and a lot of techniques to be able to respond to that by building budgeting skills and determination in academics and many different factors related to that. So just a little hint at some of those preliminary findings.
Thank you, Natalie. So at this point, it is because we are only 30-minute interviews that we are going to send this to the audience to ask some questions. So if you have any questions for Mary or Natalie or myself, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We would love to hear from you. And we're going to have Kendall and Gethin, our wonderful interns, are going to be sharing as well. And Kendall, you're going to be doing I'm going to spotlight you as well. Look at that. We'll let you organize. It looks like Dr. Hip has a question.
I do. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. It's really important work, and I enjoyed the conversation. So I'm curious, so all three of you are faculty. So I'm curious how this research plays out as a human and not just as a researcher. So how is this playing out for your mentees, advisees, folks in your classroom, and how we as faculty can be good citizens of the university and aware, because we don't get this training when we're learning about stats and research methods as graduate students, but it's become really important as a faculty member. So I'd be curious your thoughts there.
Mary, I'd love to hear about some of the programming that has been established around advocacy work. If you could share that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things that's been so rewarding about diving into this area, which I knew nothing about 5 years ago, has been learning from faculty and students across campus. There's incredible knowledge and incredible compassion, and it's been so rewarding to bring that all together. One of the initiatives that I think speaks directly to what you're asking about is a project that was started entirely by a student, Paige Swanson, who's in nutrition. So Dr. Cook and Dr. Goodell are nodding their head. They know Paige well. Paige decided she was going to develop a training for staff and faculty. And she spent this year developing the training. It's now available in Reporter, and it's called the PEAK program. PEAK stands for PAC Essentials, Advocacy and Knowledge, I believe. And faculty and staff can take that training and be listed as an advocate on the PAC Essentials site so that students will know that you are an advocate. And if they have food and housing needs, they can come to you and they will get quality information about what resources are available on campus. And it makes you be able to contribute to the accessibility for our students. So I highly recommend that PEAK training.
That is amazing. We have another question from Jeffrey Green. And he asked, can you discuss assessment of food insecurity in college students and how students describe the experience?
Yeah, so the assessment that we used is, the survey items. It's 9 items related to housing, and we used actually a 6-item USDA module to determine food insecurity because it's a little more brief. And we knew during COVID that students were not going to sit for an extensive survey. So those are ways to measure it. In terms of finding out more about students' individual experiences, it really is all about having these in-depth conversations. And how they talk about it. They talk about it initially with a lot of embarrassment and some shame, and that is due to the continuing stigma around poverty in our country. They also, though, are very motivated to tell their stories. and to share their experiences in hopes that things might be better for the next group of students coming behind them. So we have some incredibly outspoken students about their experiences. And one of the things we've worked hard to do is to lower that stigma and encourage students to speak up.
And Dr. Cook, could you talk a little bit, when we talked about the resiliency piece of things, could you talk a little bit more about that in terms of their experience?
Sure thing. So one of the questions that we asked students was, what made them build this resilience? So we phrased it as a perspective of many students may not have gotten to the point that these students were able to get to. And so what essentially got them to that point? And, they spoke of kind of these internal motivators of wanting to be able to be successful within academics, wanting to get out of certain situations and, wanting to overcome, what they had experienced from their family backgrounds. Others talked about this idea of, that degree really motivating them, that they came here because they were really very passionate about whatever it was that they were going to study. And that was kind of that thing that kept them going. But then throughout this, there's also this idea of the social support piece as well. So some students were able to find those who they could confide in and really share their experience and overcome what Mary was talking about, this idea of stigma, where others decided to keep that more so to themselves. And so that, resilience was certainly sometimes within themselves, but other times when they found this social support as well, to be able to find others who they could trust and be able to rely on. And in some cases that was emotional support. In other cases, those were, physical supports, a place to stay, friends sharing meal swipes with them or extra food with them. And, being able to tap into some of those extra resources as well through being able to learn to trust someone else, with their story.
And just for those of you who don't know what meal swipes are, on our campus, students have an ID card that when they go to the dining halls or to any of the food vendors on campus, they swipe their card and there's a certain number they get. So if some students have extra, they can share it with others. That is allowed. And that's one of the things that the university has allowed for when talking about dealing with food insecurity in particular, that they have encouraged students to allow them to use those meal swipes appropriately, but share with others who may be in need. Because one of the other things is we see that students are more likely to be food insecure or talk about being food insecure, at least in the qualitative pieces, at the end of the semester when their resources are getting depleted. I will answer the question about assessing students' help-seeking behavior. We did qualitatively by what Dr. Cook just said, but we did not measure that quantitatively. And
actually, sorry.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so we measured help-seeking and we measured help given. Mm-hmm. So we measured students' use of Feed the Pack, of the Pack Essentials Emergency Funds, all of the campus resources, and we also asked them about using local and federal resources. So are they using SNAP benefits, which is food stamps? Have they accessed Section 8 vouchers? So we did ask a lot about what resources. We also asked them whether they gave anybody food, shared their housing, shared their transportation, or gave money to others. And what we found was that students that were food insecure or had experienced homelessness were more likely to give their resources than other students. So.
Yeah. And you know what, Mary, my brain, when I was thinking help seeking, was thinking more of scale development work, not that. So thank you for intervening on my behalf. Yeah, so absolutely. And we saw that in the interviews too, that students were more likely to share because they themselves had risks. Kendall, do we have any more questions? I know we've run out of time, but I'd love to answer that last question. I think there is one.
Yes, ma'am. We have one more from Savannah Hobbs. She says, I'm curious if any themes emerged about students experiencing food insecurity versus nutrition insecurity. Also, are students with certain characteristics more likely to experience food insecurity or homelessness, such as grad versus undergrad, first gen, etc.?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. There are some populations of students who are more at risk. The question about grad versus undergrad is interesting because students that are working on their master's degrees are significantly more likely to experience homelessness than undergrads or students working on their doctoral degree. Students of color are more at risk for food insecurity and homelessness. First gen, students that are Pell Grant recipients, students who are transferring here from community college. So there are some groups that we know we could zero in some resources for. And that is part of that moving upstream, right? Instead of waiting until students are experiencing homelessness, let's move upstream, identify students who might be most at risk, and get resources, make more resources available to them. We could also do things like paying a living wage for our research assistants and our teaching assistants. Don't get me started. I did want to make sure everybody knew that I put a link in the chat to the full report for folks who have questions about the quantitative piece.
Thank you. And so unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. And I want to thank again Dr. Mary Haskett and Dr. Natalie Cook for speaking with us about their research on hunger and homelessness in college students, specifically at NC State. And I want to thank all of you out there for watching and listening to this show. And I want to remind you that we have a broadcast every third Friday of the month at 2 p.m. Our next show will include an interview with Dr. Randy Jurtle from the Department of Biological Sciences in the College of Sciences about epigenetics. And you can find more information about Wolfpack Wellness research in our previous show's recordings at the Wolfpack Wellness website. I am your host, Dr. Suzie Goodell. Our wellness interns are Gethin Condren and Kendall Morrison. Our webmaster is Truman Lee, and our research librarian is Cindy Levine. Until next time, be well.